I think you used a word which really is my word of the year, which is serendipity. I do genuinely believe that one makes their own luck. And if you try and you really put your head down and you focus and you care about something, eventually luck will find you.
Tommy is the CEO and co-founder of BeZero Carbon, a London-based company that specialises in decarbonisation and natural capital advisory services. Prior to launching BeZero, Tommy spent a decade working in politics and markets in London, Brussels and New York. We talk about how, when he was working for Merrill Lynch Bank in New York, he was at a rugby game in Japan and was hit by what he's meant to be doing to change the world. You're listening to Going Conscious, the podcast where we discover new ways to live a more conscious life of fulfillment and freedom. Each week, I speak with entrepreneurs, academics, and changemakers who have made big transformations, left unfulfilling lives behind, and found meaning in this new world where purpose drives success. Let's get inspired to live our unique journeys to the fullest. Let's explore the impact we want to make and deepen our understanding of ourselves, each other, and this beautiful world around us. Live your freedom. I'm your host, Nikki Trott. I'm excited to bring you this fascinating episode with Tommy. He's a very good friend of mine who I've known since we were teenagers growing up in North London. You can sense our familiarity as I challenge and confront him a bit with the questions I'm wondering. Some of the things I think you might wonder too when you listen. I think this makes for even more interesting listening. We talk about Tommy's belief in tweaking the edges to make a big combined impact, rather than revolution. We talk about serendipity and how to make your own luck, the shift of the decade from climate awareness to climate action, the huge new trend of linking ecology and finance, recognizing the ecological impact of corporates, environmental economics, and Tommy's view that we've been trying to bring capitalism to the environment for too long, and now it's time to bring the environment to capitalism. Now let's go to our conversation. Hi, Tommy. Welcome to Going Conscious.
Thanks, Nikki. Great to be here.
So Tommy has a background in politics, more recently a macro research analyst job in a bank in New York, and this year he returned to London and co-founded BeZero to help companies understand and reduce their carbon emissions. So a big change. And since I heard that you've made this change, I've been dying to know, why did you decide to make such a shift?
Well, this is a slightly funny place, but I was having a review one year, and my boss rather cheekily and provocatively said to me, "You're 31, you go up for promotion at the bank, but I think you're a pop star without an album. What is your album?" Which I think to me meant, what am I about? What am I going to really be doing with my life? And I worked for the Green Party initially in the European Parliament, and I worked in finance and big trends, and I thought, the two big things that are going to go on in the next 30 years are the shift to automation and how that changes society, and how we respond to climate change and how that changes the economy. And I'm not a software engineer, but I am someone that's sort of very interested in the green economy. And I think for some reason, some way, shape or form, I was in Japan last year watching the Rugby World Cup, and it just hit me like a train that this is what I had to do. And so, about a year ago to the day, I started the process of exiting New York and exiting my career and persuading a bunch of ex-colleagues and scientists to join me in this venture.
Wow, it hit you like a train while you were watching the Rugby World Cup in Japan, so you just suddenly realised you needed to make a big change.
Well, I'd been debating the idea of what to do next, and I think what I was looking for was the right medium. And I was talking to my friend who's a musician, actually, and we were talking about the sort of move towards decarbonising tours and how he would go around the world flying and playing at these events or these festivals, and how he was becoming increasingly conscious that it was a bad thing to do. And I was just sort of trying to explain to him that actually there's not that difficult to change some of his behavior. And then we started talking and riffing on this idea while we were having a beer on this sort of volcanic town in Japan called Beppu. And honestly, like a wave of adrenaline just started coming through me, and so much so that the next day, and this is a true story, I actually tattooed the word zero on my arm so that I would actually come back and follow through with it. And genuinely, that energy is still with me, and I'm still trying to sort of channel it. just this idea that actually there were so many parts of the economy that could be shifting and changing without fundamentally altering the way in which they operate. And that was the thing that I really wanted to bring to the environmental movement, this idea that it's not this huge scale sort of revolutionary shift. It's more about tweaking the things at the side. And actually, a lot of people could be doing it without really changing that much of their behavior. And that subtlety was really and continues to be the sort of thing that was powering me forward.
Wow, that's amazing. I didn't know you got a tattoo. That's such a great story. So you really did have to follow through when you got back. And what was it like then to start actually putting that into practice and realize you need to connect your idea with your lifestyle?
So I came back from Japan. I was there working in markets, trying to explain, the run up to the US election, the central bank policy, and all this sort of stuff that's going on, and taking our economy into weird places. And I was just sort of thinking, right, well, the first step is I had to persuade some people to leave their jobs and do it with me, because although I have plenty of skills, it's not an area or a type of economy where I can, you can do everything on your own. So the first thing I did was to call up my best friend at work, who was the UK debt strategist, and then another guy who genuinely I met 2 days later in the smoking area of a rugby game. This wonderful Welsh guy. And we started talking. And then I called him up when I was at the Tokyo Museum of Modern Art. And within an hour, he'd said, I'm on board. So this guy I'd met once, he was family and was standing behind me at this rugby game. And then an hour later, after a phone call, and, we're still together, and he's the COO of the company. So within about a week, I had 2 people that were on board. And then I just started sort of building it out from there. And then, the challenge really was getting to the end of the financial year, because in banking, for love it or loathe it, about half of your pay is paid at the end of the year in a bonus. So that was very important to secure for me, because that was going to be the money I lived off to start this business. So I just sort of saw out the year. But interestingly, I kind of handed in my resignation about a week before lockdown really started happening. So I'd done this big work. I basically spent 3 months preparing a sort of business plan, and I persuaded a friend from Facebook and a friend from work and this guy from Wales to come together, and we'd done a workshop, and it was all looking kind of good. And then obviously, just as I handed my resignation and and I'm starting my sort of notice period, the world rolls over, and I was suddenly doing 14-hour days trying to explain the financial crisis to investors, at the same time as living in New York, packing up my life, trying to get to my friends to come and join me on this venture, and trying to work out what on earth I would be selling and creating out of this company. So that transition was somewhat reasonable up to February, but then in March and April became incredibly difficult, because it seemed like the world was breaking apart, and I was there with sort of 2 jobs and no job, and trying to emigrate back to London. So it was quite an interesting experience.
Wow, it sounds full on. What got you through that time?
It's a good question. I think, and just to throw it in the mix, I got glandular fever, so that was great. What got me through that time? I think genuinely, as I sort of said to you about that wave of energy, it'd been 10 years of working full time, and we were just talking before the call about this idea of the relationship between you and place, and having this static place that you go to every day, and you're waking up and you have to be there. And although I had quite a flexible life, considering I worked at an investment bank, my boss wasn't particularly hardcore, and I could kind of come and go as I wanted. It was still a case that you had to be there. 4 weeks holiday a year or 3 weeks in the US, you had to be there every day. And the idea that I could go away and do my own thing and spend 6 months or 18 months, as the case may be, trying to flesh out this idea, going back to that first thing I said, my album, that was really what got me through it. And also, I was looking forward to coming back to London. It'd been 3 years of living abroad, and it was nice to come back to my family and my friends. So it wasn't a challenge of trying to move away from that world. It was just a genuine sort of administrative burden of actually having to exit this. And it's one of those things where you get into a period of 2 to 3 months where you're like, right, I've just got to get through this period. So that's kind of how I saw it.
And it's so interesting to hear how you met your Welshman, and it sounds very serendipitous. And there you go, you have your new business partner. And people talk a lot about how, you need to choose your business partners more carefully than the person you marry. I've heard people say it's really even more than a marriage, and there's so much that goes into that, as you know. So how did you have the confidence and know that this was the right person to partner with in such a short time? And the same for him as well.
I think you used the word, which really is my word of the year, which is serendipity. I do genuinely believe that one makes their own luck. And if you try and you try and you really put your head down and you focus and you care about something, eventually luck will find you. And so, in the instance of Tom, he's in the process of selling an education company which specialized in training for renewable energy. And so a lot of what we're trying to do at BeZero is focused around education. So it made a lot of sense that, and I'll come on to explain what that means, but it made a lot of sense for that. But also he had experience of building one of the top training companies in the UK. I've only ever worked at an institution. So it's, I had no experience of that kind of thing. So, once we started getting through that first initial buzz of, great, this is an emerging market, this is a great place to think about, it became quite clear to me that actually our skills were incredibly complementary. I think the more marriage-like relationship is with my best friend from B of A, where he and I were the Brexit analysts in the UK. We spent 2 years. I did the equity market, he did the debt market, explaining every orifice of the Brexit debate to investors in the UK and internationally. And we worked very, very closely together. I think he and I are, in some ways, the sort of creative spark of the more kind of hardcore bits of the carbon market that we do together. And that's kind of, I think, as you say, a bit more of a marriage, because we're both sort of being very creative, and that creates, lots of tension sometimes and lots of sort of joy sometimes. And Tom, who's our third co-founder, not that he's not very creative, just he's a sort of like calming influence. He's a balm, with good experience. So in that sense, it sort of works very well having three people, because it's sort of, we all kind of play off each other. So that's how it's emerged. We did have a fourth co-founder from ex-Facebook and Deliveroo, but it ended up not wanting to commit to London and wanting to commit to sort of a startup lifestyle. And so he sort of went back to the arms of the tech world. And I think probably it was the right decision, actually, given where he was in his life.
How come you're all men that have founded the company?
Well, it's a very good question, and one that I do have a good answer for. It wasn't the case that I meant that way. I actually asked 3 people, 2 girls and 3 men, and the girls both quite bluntly said no and were not interested. And the 3 guys, 2 of which continued to be on, said yes. And I've reflected a lot on that, actually. I think one thing that I would say with this is it's quite a risky venture. People have given up pretty good careers to go to sweat equity, to live off zero, to live off, their savings effectively. And I think one thing that just as feedback in attempting to sort of poach people and get them on board was, I found it harder to persuade the women that I really wanted to join as partners to give up the careers that they'd spent 10, 12 years building and go to sort of no income and lots of insecurity. I found that a harder sell for some reason, no particular reason why, than the guys who were a bit more fed up with their careers and a bit more up for sort of risking it all. It could be that on one hand, the women I spoke to had worked maybe harder to get where they had and saw it as a bigger risk to leave. Or it might have been just the personalities that I picked, agnostic to the gender, were all that way around. I haven't got a particularly good answer, but it is the case that I found it harder to persuade women to be a co-founder or a partner at our company. And that's an interesting thing that I've just, have to reflect on.
I like some of your observations there. Good to hear that you've been thinking about it anyway. I'm sure as your team continues to grow, it will become more diverse. It's something that you've already been very aware of.
Yeah, look, I think we've known each other for years and I have lots of strong female friends. And the one thing they always like to point out to me is the lack of women, although we do have some women now. But as I said, it's never by design. I mean, what I'm selling is the opportunity to come on this journey with me, and I can't pay you anything. Although we do have a few paid employees now, but I couldn't pay you anything, and I had no idea quite what the destination was. I mean, it's quite the risk. So I can't really be a chooser in the sense of, I'm approaching some people that I think have the right skills, and if they kind of pop out of the woodwork and it's right for them and their stage of life at that time, then I have to sort of make do with the people that emerge. And that's kind of the way I've been playing it. But I think, as you say, it's been 6 to 8 months of operating now. There's 8 of us. 4 people are on. We pay 4 people, and there's we have another partner who we're starting to put on the payroll. And yes, as we recruit, that element of it, both diversity and gender equality, have become much more important. But one thing I'd note is, interestingly, and this is shown in the demographic analysis, science-based education does even of itself give itself a bias towards men. So finding environmentally or scientifically literate candidates that also satisfy a more gender and diversity balanced corporate profile, I think is a very big priority for us. But the challenge is also, funny enough, for us, is that lots of the really great women that we've been looking to hire don't actually live in the UK. So we're just in the process of hiring, and the three candidates, the best two, one lives in San Francisco and one lives in Australia. So it's also not just a thing about gender and diversity; it's also about location these days. So it's a challenge. It's something that we try to take on board and we try to build into our approach and be very mindful of. And I think that's just something that you have to do as you grow. But also, certainly in those first couple of months, it was really, if I'm lucky enough to persuade someone to come and do this journey with me, then that, those first couple of people, I'm just, whoever comes out is who comes out. I don't think I could be discriminatory either way.
And why is it important that they live in the UK with how the world of work is changing so much? How do you see that working for your business?
I think that's a good question. I think we've got he's an intern, but he came top of his class at Princeton Engineering, and he's very quick to remind us that he's a hell of a lot more than an intern. But this guy Riley works from Virginia, and he was our first employee. And it's not a case of having to be in the UK, I think, at all. Actually, the only challenge is time difference. So if you're in Australia and your working day is entirely at odds with our working day, I actually found that the work doesn't suffer. In general, you can get the work done, and that's fine. Their sense of being part of your journey is diluted. So it's not the case if they're in France or in a sort of European time zone. But I think one thing we've experienced with Riley in Virginia, and he's only 5 hours behind, which is a lot easier, is that he feels left out. He's not part of the gang, and that's the only real challenge. But I actually think with the more senior hires, our chief ecologist lives in Nottingham, and he's only been down twice, once for his interview and once to sort of flesh out a workshop, and that hasn't affected our ability to work together at all. So I think depends on the level. If for the junior employees, it's quite nice for them to have a sense of working with the senior people and also working with a team. But I think as you get older and more specialized in your skill sets, I don't think place becomes that important, especially if occasionally you can meet up or at least occasionally have sort of detailed calls. I think that's fine.
So can you tell us a bit about your mission at BeZero?
Sure. So BeZero Carbon, as I said, came up with the idea in Japan. We have been trying to find our way and our identity in what I believe is the big market of the next 30 to 40 years, which is really how we respond from an economic perspective to the challenge of building a lower carbon economy. And in a sort of very small, humble way, BeZero does two things. One, we help companies decarbonize. So decarbonisation is the active process of reducing your emissions. You can also offset them, but that's not an active process. And I'll sort of come on to explain what I mean by that. And we also do this other area called natural capital. Now, natural capital is this emerging ecological trend, which is to say, how do we value the entire ecology of the Earth and of the planet, not just the carbon within that ecology. And natural capital is, touted to be $1 trillion asset class in the next 30 years. And really what it means is we help value ecosystems and say the benefit that, ecological enhancement, whether it be conservation or whether it be clean technology or those sort of trends, the benefit of those types of actions has an ecological outcome. And that ecological outcome has a monetary value that you can associate with the capitalist system. Now, that's really interesting because the other side to that trend is that corporations are increasingly acknowledging, and they're starting with Microsoft, that they have a bigger impact above and beyond carbon. They have an impact on biodiversity, on pollination, on water systems, on plastic flows. And if they start to recognize that as being a cost, in the language you'd call a natural capital liability, that unlocks, let's just say Microsoft says, right, we recognize all of the ecological damage that we create through all of our products and all of our supply chains. That damage has a cost, which is, let's say, $5 billion a year. Now, that's $5 billion that could be invested in natural capital enhancement, i.e., supporting ecosystems, generating new ecosystems, creating new sources of biodiversity. And that combination of the two, that linking of ecology and finance, is a huge new sort of trend, and one that we're sort of hopefully and excitingly trying to sort of contribute to. But to bring you back to the carbon story, It's a bit more advanced and a lot more specific, I'd say. So in the UK, it's now law that we have to be net zero by 2050. Indeed, a number of countries have joined that. And, very interestingly, I think America will probably join that now with sort of the news out of Biden. But crucially, China have actually said that by 2060, they want to be net zero. Now, what does that look like? It means an UK economy currently emits about 5.5 gigatons of CO2. And for that to come down, they need to come down to somewhere around 80% or 90% lower than that. And that process of decarbonisation requires two things. One, it requires changing the way we operate our economy such that our processes, our way of living, our productivity is predicated on lower carbon emitting actions. So that's transition to renewables, that's transition to electric vehicles, that's creating different types of space and place in the economy which are less carbon intensive. However, it also means what's called a nature-based solution, which is that we have to enhance roughly 30% of the move towards decarbonisation. It comes from enhancing our ecosystem. And the easiest thing to think about is planting trees. But in general, that involves bigger trends such as rewilding, a new sense of sharing our agricultural space, about valuing that, and generally creating a more environmentally rich and carbon draining or carbon sequestering sort of environment beyond the urban, beyond the person. So there's two trends. And what we're trying to say is, right, our own little way, you're a company, you're a major bookshop chain in the UK, you emit 1,000 tons of carbon a year. We're going to help you collect that. And then we're going to say, okay, here are all the ways you can cut it. And then we're going to help you communicate that to your audiences, both internal and external. And so our process at BeZero is what we call the 3 C's of decarbonisation, which is a framework that we've created to help company do what we call end-to-end decarbonisation. So start with the proposition, which is, what is my problem? What is my carbon footprint? Present solutions. So how do I cut those emissions? And then help them deliver that as a piece of communications, because profitable companies ultimately do want to tell people that they're doing these things. They also tell the government because it's regulated. But that communications element is really, as I said before, all around education and transparency. And that's our proposition. So it's the 3 C's of decarbonisation.
So with corporate culture, investor portfolios, the financial industry, Wall Street, how are these companies actually being incentivized? You mentioned the changes in regulation. Is that what's driving companies? Or is there something else as well that makes them actually want to change? Because it seems like a complete flip when they've all just been about growth and profit at the cost of the environment.
So I think that's, you touched on a number of points. One is, what is driving? What are the pull factors, or what are the push factors? Sorry, should I say? And two, why now? I guess take a step back and say, why now? I believe the 2020s is what I call the decade of climate action. We've been in an era of climate awareness, one in which the main sort of narrative has been, look, the environment is a thing. We have to care about it. We have to understand it, and we have to recognize that it's deteriorating. I think that by and large, that narrative has been successful, and that we are coming to the next stage of the argument, which is great. The majority of people recognize that this is a problem, but what do we do about it? And I think that kind of follows on to that idea of why corporates, why now? And, I think the really key change, and this is something that really definitely was a big sort of wind in the sails from leaving Wall Street, was this trend called ESG. And ESG is environmental and social governance. And it's a sort of catch-all term to describe a wave of change within how we understand a corporate and how we value that corporate. So traditionally, you would value a company predicated on its profitability, effectively. Is this company going to make more money tomorrow than it does today? And is the share price going to go up, over time? That comes back to the Friedman essay, which was the idea that the only real true purpose of a company was to deliver returns to its shareholders. That's its only social responsibility. I think that's really being sort of debunked as we realize that, to be sort of more ecological about it, that the economy operates within a wider system of ecology, and that ecosystem has an effect back on the economy. And what that means is you get disruption. So if you're operating assets, look at the wildfires in California, you're operating an electricity grid, and that electricity grid is also subject to environmental catastrophe. You can have a very big problem because, you're a utility company and you're operating these wires through an area which is incredibly prone to wildfires, and a spark goes off on one of your grids or one of your cables, that spark launches a wildfire, and that wildfire wipes out a section of an area, you're going to get sued. And that in fact indeed shut down, one of the biggest utility companies in California. And so that connection between the environment and the corporate is becoming very, very clear for many people to see, certainly from the side of sort of natural disaster. But to be a little bit more kind of wonky for a second, this is very important because a lot of the way in which money moves around the world has been predicated on revenues or income from fossil fuels. And that oil money, which is sort of generally flows around the world, both as investment capital and as money recycled from the purchasing of fossil fuels, that money is becoming a bit scared because ultimately the shift towards sort of more renewable sources of energy is causing big macro tectonic shifts, both in the countries that have predicated their incomes on fossil fuel. So, Saudi Arabia, all the OPEC countries, Russia, etc., America. But also, they're saying, look, if we're going to be renewable in the next 20 years, I have this thing what's called a stranded asset. No one wants an oil field in the North Sea or in the Gulf of Mexico if that oil is not going to be worth anything. So the banks are going, oh, crikey, we've lent all this money to all these different parts of the economy, these industries, and these industries are not going to be worth what we thought they were going to be worth 20 years ago. And that link to the kind of the corporate profitability mindset, connecting that to the environmental outcomes has started to become not just a sort of dotted line, but actually a firm line. And that, I think, is what's really changed in the piping of sort of capital markets or capitalism. And I'm trying really to say, look, I was seeing this line forming and solidifying, from my seat in New York. And actually, how do I kind of become a preacher or an evangelical for the fact that the days of seeing the environment and the economy as being two separate things are over? And this is what it looks like. People have exposure to the environment. That exposure can determine the way in which you operate your business. And my personal, or the BeZero's personal philosophy is the best thing that you can do to really help companies or corporates understand, this challenge of environmental change is link it to a price. And I think that's my big kind of sort of philosophical contribution, or in my own small way, is if I can convince a boardroom that they need to price the environment into their business model, turning environmental outcomes into a cost allows that business to understand the language that it already operates in. Because you know very well that if you have a cost on your balance sheet, you look to reduce that cost. You look to engage with it. You understand. You can hold it up and shake it around and interrogate it. But if it's only expressed as a sort of like virtue or as an intangible, it's a lot harder to interrogate. So bring that all together. The big unifying log line of BeZero is to make carbon a line item in your cost structure, because embedding carbon in your everyday decision making allows businesses, corporates, whomever, organizations to start engaging with this in a way which they already understand, which is a sort of accounting term. So making carbon or even ecology a line item in your cost structure, that's the linking sentence, which is that kind of firm line between the environment and the economy, which I think previously was a dotted line.
Sounds incredibly exciting that you're seeing this link between ecology and the economy and really helping to drive it. I'm wondering, are there any potential downsides of maybe reducing is the wrong word, but I'll try it, of reducing the environmental impact of a corporate to a financial figure and taking out the wider perspective?
Yeah, so, I'm not going to speak in economics terms too much, but the downside is very simple. We talk about these things called a cost curve. So do you have an upward facing cost curve, i.e. is your costs going to increase over time, or you have a downward facing cost curves, which is, are they going to reduce over time? Now, the biggest challenge, so environmental economics came about by this wonderful figure from Cambridge in the 1920s called Arthur Cecil Pigou, who's a bit of a hero of mine. And he basically studied the pollution from coal factories or coal plants. And he realized that it was starting to affect the environment around Cambridge, and he sort of started investigating this. And so you get this term, which he invented, called externalities. And an externality is an unintended consequence of an action. So environmentalism in environmental economics or ecological economics in the parlance is about internalizing an externality. And that's kind of what I was talking about with price. Now, the challenge for a business is, I think I sort of said this to you before we started, the challenge for business in today's world is many of them are terrified that they're not going to exist tomorrow. They're just fundamentally challenged by the economic recession created by the COVID pandemic. And so you're going into a business and I'm saying, look, great, I've got this great idea, why don't we price the environment and attribute a cost to it, and then you can start interrogating it and reducing your emissions. And they're saying, listen, I've just laid off 20% of my staff. I can't recognize a new cost right now. That's the last thing that I can do. So going back to this idea of cost curves, our pitch to businesses is generally by 2050, it's law in the UK that you have to be net zero. So you've got two ways you can do it. You can recognize your costs today, for those companies that can or have enough economic health to, and you can start investing in change, investing in decarbonizing and lower your profile over time. That's a downward facing cost curve because your liability, your emissions are going to be reduced over time by your actions. Now, I call that, to spin it on sort of Marxism, owning the means of reduction. So you're not owning the means of production, you're owning the means of reduction because you're internalizing that cost and you're recognizing it and you're investing in your own processes. The alternative is an upward facing cost curve, which is to say, I'm just going to be led by the minimum requirement legally. So in the UK, if you're a large business now, you have to legally report your emissions, but there's no obligation for the private sector to cut them above and beyond what's called the regulated sector, which is sort of heavy industries and utilities, which take part in what's called the European Emissions Trading Scheme. So the majority of businesses in terms of employment do not have to actually actively engage in reducing their emissions. So that, to link it all back to the beginning, you have two options right now. You can recognize this additional cost and you can start investing in your own change, because that's not least a very good thing to do for the environment, but it's a good thing to do in terms of risk management and understanding your business. Or you can say, look, I can't do that right now, or I don't think the risk reward for doing that right now is sufficiently attractive. But the danger to that argument is that you have to increasingly be affected by regulations. And two, there are taxations that are going to come in the next 5 years. I think it's going to basically be law that every company has to actively start reducing their emissions because the UK is falling behind its climate change targets. And that's going to be a cost. So if you imagine you're a business and you say, right, I'm now regulated to reduce my emissions, but also I'm being valued by society on my ability to do that, and you've already made a head start, you're going to be miles ahead of your competitors. And if you haven't, you're actually going to be paying that tax to the government, and you're still going to have to be investing in your internal change. So start now and pay half, or do it later and pay twice. That's kind of the pitch.
If you enjoy Going Conscious, please subscribe for a new episode every Wednesday. If you think your friends and networks would benefit from listening, please share this podcast of fulfillment and freedom with them. And if you listen on Apple Podcasts, please rate and review. It's great to read what you think, and your support makes a big difference. Together, let's grow our courage and tools to transform and live the lives we really want to. As well as creating Going Conscious, I work as a transformation coach and conscious brand consultant. I'm on a mission to help holistically maximize conscious entrepreneurs to drive positive changes for themselves, others, and the planet. I can help you to transition and level up personally, and I can help your brand grow and make a bigger impact. To connect with me and find out more about how we can work together, find me on Instagram @NikkiTrott or on my website, nikkitrott.com. Please get in touch. I'd love to hear from you, and let's talk about your path of growth and development. What about greenwashing? Is greenwashing an issue you're facing, and how do you approach it? And perhaps you could start by just giving us a quick definition of greenwashing as well.
Of course. So I think that's a really good challenge that we face. Greenwashing, now this isn't a textbook definition, but to my mind, greenwashing is attributing an action and capitalizing on the environmental zeitgeist by aligning an activity that you do with the trend, which is I'm engaging with the environment, but not doing it in a sufficient way where if someone were to really interrogate your actions, you could demonstrably prove that you are actually reducing your emissions. So in other words, you're saying that you're doing it, but you're not really doing it. Now, in terms of greenwashing, the area that I would say is the most prevalent right now is the industry of offsetting. Offsetting your carbon emissions basically means that I pollute 1x and I buy the right to a project that claims that it reduces 1x. So I drive my car and I fly to New York, and that creates 1 ton of carbon emissions, and I plant equivalent of 4 trees, and those trees live for 50 years, and that's the equivalent of 1 ton being sequestered from the environment. Now, this is a very important industry. Offsetting is being recognised by the UK Climate Change Committee as being about 30% of the answer to reducing our emissions over time, and the IPCC as well recognises it as being about 20 to 30% of the solution. But offsetting itself as an industry is incredibly problematic. It's very illiquid, i.e. it's not very easy to trade these things. 2, it's very opaque. So greenwashing is really applicable to companies in 2 ways. 1, I think, and I'm very wary of the word sustainability. And 2, I'm very wary of offsetting. So let me sort of explain to you what I mean by both. Sustainability is an incredibly important word, but it has become a catch-all phrase to mean anything that interacts with the idea of making the planet better or making society better. And the absolute bugbear of mine is companies that have sustainability statements, i.e. we are committed to doing X, Y, and Z, and then you drill into what they actually do, and there's almost no evidence to say what they're really doing. Often, at the very best, they're basically exporting the problem to a consultant, and that consultant is helping them communicate their brand positioning first and foremost. So greenwashing from a kind of corporate PR side is really taking advantage of the trends in sustainability, aligning yourself with those trends. And then when you really dig beneath the surface, there's very little evidence of change. So that's greenwashing in terms of PR. Greenwashing in terms of decarbonisation is buying into this idea that you can offset your emissions and not taking responsibility to reduce them first and foremost. But even more so within offsetting, and this is where we are sort of investing a huge amount of our time and resources. The industry itself is very, very nascent. And so, basically, as I said, it's opaque. So it's hard to understand what these things really do. You buy forestry here, or you buy a chemical capture system there, or a biomass thing there. What do these things really mean? And what on earth is a ton of carbon? I think that's a really important thing to ask. No one understands what a ton of carbon is. And then to say, okay, well, look, what can we do at BeZero to make this market more efficient? Some of us are ex sort of research analysts. Our job was to make the market more efficient. And so what we've done is we've gone off and we've hired a couple of climate scientists and our training in economics. And we've tried to say, how can we improve the standards and improve the accuracy of the offsetting market so that when someone buys an offset, i.e. there is an action within their business that they can't substitute away from, they can't actively reduce, and that residual is applicable for offsetting. And that's the highest quality way to think about it. So let's say flying, some people have to fly. Going back to that very point at the very beginning, if you're a musician and you want to play in Australia, you can't take the train. You have 2 options. You can not do that gig, or you can fly to Australia and perform that gig. So it's a non-substitutable action. And that is very suitable to offsetting, because the world shouldn't stop tomorrow, but you should be balancing the environmental action based on the type of activity. And you say, look, if I am going to offset this action, how do I guarantee that the thing that I'm buying, this offset credit, is actually reducing or avoiding a ton of carbon? So we have literally spent 6 months interrogating from a science perspective, sort of scientific literature, every different type of offset in the market and creating a scoring system which allows you to say, how accurate is this credit at really reducing emissions? And then we've done reviews, what's called financial portfolio theory, to transform it into saying, if I bring together several of these credits, I can actually effectively and with some genuine rigor and scientific integrity say that this combination of offsets does reduce a ton of carbon. So that's our small way of saying, how do we avoid greenwashing within our business proposition, but also throwing a gauntlet back to the industry and back to corporates and saying, it's not okay, it's not good enough just to go off and buy 20,000 tons of Indian solar panel credits, because ultimately the science beneath that is not good, it's shaky. So we think that you're really, in a sort of not terrible quality way, but you're actually slightly greenwashing by saying that you've offset your emissions via buying this. So it's the combination of the two. Avoid baseless sustainability statements. And if you do take action revolved around offsetting, ensure that you're doing it from a much more scientifically informed way.
So is there regulation, or how is it regulated in terms of what constitutes to offsetting a certain amount of carbon? And I know this is a global market, so...
It's a really interesting question. I think it comes back to the foundation of the carbon market under the Kyoto Protocol, and the idea that a carbon credit, i.e. 1 ton of carbon, could be traded as a financial instrument. And then that's developed into initially the regulated market. So just use Europe as an example. 45% of emissions in Europe are regulated. If you're an industrial manufacturer or you're EDF or what's called heavy industries, you have to buy a certain number of credits every year. And every year, let's just say there's 100 credits across Europe. And over time, you're trying to reduce emissions by 50%, and they're doing, they've got to do that in the next 20 years. You're going to be taking 2.5 of those credits out of the market. So in year 1, you have 100 credits. In year 2, you have, 97.5. In year 3, 95. And that means that those companies have got a diminishing supply of credits, which allow them to pollute. So that's kind of how the industry works. The voluntary sector, which is kind of what we're talking about a little bit more here, in terms of you being a person that wants to offset your flight or you being a company that wants to offset their emissions, is broadly unregulated. So we've actually gone through the process of trying to be regulated via the UK government and via one of the platforms called Market. Quite a difficult process. But you don't actually need to be regulated to sell an offset. So I'll give you an example. We spoke to this forestry company in Scotland, and they said to us, we're the highest quality source of forestry credits in the UK. Now, our chief ecologist wrote the UK's Woodland Carbon Code. He was one of the founding committee members. And this company in Scotland, they don't adhere to the Woodland Carbon Code. The Woodland Carbon Code is a piece of regulation by the government saying this is the way in which to create forestry. And this is the best way to do it. This is the methodology. This is the scientific analysis you should use. And we believe that is the best quality forestry standard in the world. And this company in Scotland, they didn't abide by it. So I said to them, without being too specific, what buffers do you use? What scientific methodology do you use? Oh, well, we use this. Well, why don't you use the one set up by the UK to create a uniform system? We don't need to because no one asks us to do that. When people come and trade with us, they don't go, oh, are you a member of the UK Woodland Carbon Code? And, for me, it's like, well, what are you doing? You're basically exploiting what you call regulatory arbitrage. You're exploiting a lack of regulations to missell a product. Even funnier, they were selling it at twice the price of the companies that go through this process. So they were half as accurate and twice the price. Now, you can imagine that wasn't received very well by this company. In fact, they don't respond to my emails anymore. But that's the sort of place that we're in right now. We're in a space where half of the market, indeed, this is a market estimated to grow from $1 billion of transactions a year today to $200 billion by 2050. That's a large increase globally. And the regulations around the voluntary use of offsetting emissions are very loose. They're very kind of Wild West. And that kind of speaks to why we've tried to invent a system to understand them. But also it leads people to really, I believe, exploiting the economic and social zeitgeist of climate change and actually cutting corners when it comes down to it. And then if you call them out on it, there's nothing more challenging than calling out someone who thinks that they're being high quality and then telling them that actually they've cut loads of corners and that they're not. It leads to very interesting conversations.
How do you apply decarbonisation to individuals, to how we choose to live our personal lives? We've talked about it on a really huge global scale, but what about for each of us and how we interact with our world and our environment?
So I'll bring you back to the 3 C's. I think this is a nice thing for people to remember. The first thing you have to do to engage, whether you're a person, an organization, a government, is you go, what is my environmental footprint? So you have to collect your emissions. And that collection process will immediately give you what I call carbon hotspots, but give you the profile of your activities that create a polluting impact. So let's just take myself as an example. I do eat some meat. I actually can't drive, but I don't drive. This year, I won't have flown very much, but previously in New York, I did fly quite a lot back and forward to London. So by a large margin, my biggest source of emissions is flying. My diet is pretty low because I don't eat too much meat. My commuting or my ability to travel domestically has incredibly low footprint because I only use public transport and cycle. And then the other main one is how do I power my house in terms of heating and gas? So the big 4 buckets are your lifestyle in terms of diet, your international travel, how you power your house, heating and gas, electricity, and then, as I said, your how you move around domestically. And so, from a person, you go, okay, well, let's calculate my emissions. In the UK, the average footprint is between 7 and 10 tons a year, and the majority of that will come from, as I said, those 4 buckets. So, for a person, the first step is to say, okay, well, how do I understand what my emissions are and where they come from? And then each one of these 4 buckets has a different solution. So the easiest thing that you can do is make sure that the place that you live in, the gas and electricity, is powered by renewables. So in our business, we're partnered with Good Energy. Good Energy are the best renewable, for various technical reasons. They're a fantastic renewable company. But if you're a household person, if you're just a person living at home, transitioning towards that, in the UK, it's about 50-50 right now of homes are powered by renewable and non-renewable. That's a really good thing that you can do tomorrow, and it's not very expensive. So that would reduce your emissions by about 20% as a person. The other thing you could do is you could say, first and foremost, I'm only going to travel internationally if I really have to. And when I do, make sure that you fly economy. Business travel is about 3 times the impact of economy. In fact, first class is about 7 times the impact of economy. And the only time I think that business travel is reasonable is if you are working at an organization, it's a red-eye flight, and you've got to be up the next day delivering, your product and your services to audiences in another country. In which case, potentially then, business travel is worth it because you do need to get your rest. But for like a holiday maker, making sure that you don't, just willy-nilly fly to another place for a weekend, taking that on board and understanding your actions, that's another way you could do it. So making sure you don't fly business and making sure you don't take unnecessary flights, that's the second one. The third one is diet and lifestyle. So by far and away, the biggest source of emissions that most people would interact with is their consumption of industrially farmed meat, and indeed sometimes vegetables as well. But meat is the big one. So I'm not a proponent that the world should go vegan. I'm a proponent that the world should be somewhat cognizant that you shouldn't be advocating for industrially manufactured meat and eating things that, like taking flights too often. You shouldn't be eating meat every day, and you certainly shouldn't be eating very bad quality meat every day. And so, the great example I'll give you is, which is slightly counterintuitive, is the carbon footprint of lamb farmed in New Zealand is lower than lamb farmed in Herefordshire if you live in London. So it's not also the case that you need to just eat locally, because that's not necessarily always the answer. Industrial farming techniques in the UK, even for small holdings, mean that the feed that they're given to the farm in Herefordshire could mean that lamb has a higher carbon footprint than wild lamb reared in New Zealand, frozen and refrigerated and shipped to the UK. So from a diet perspective, it's not necessarily about just going local. It's about understanding, not over consuming, not having, what I would call gratuitous kind of dietary standards, and making sure that when you do eat certain things, whether it's fish or meat, which I do think are kind of good for a balanced diet, you do it in a very conscious way, and you understand that you should just eat high quality food and less often. So that's the 3 buckets. And then from commuting side, obviously you can transition towards an electric vehicle. That's, gas has a much lower footprint than any other type of fossil fuel, and gas is what ultimately powers electric vehicles. And then obviously I would encourage, where possible, commuting via public transport or commuting via cycling. Obviously cycling has a double benefit because it makes you fitter. And if you start making 5-10% changes across each of those buckets, you can reduce your overall footprint the next year by 30 to 40%. So, doing a little bit at the margin can compound into a much bigger result than just trying to go, right, I'm going to go 100% vegan tomorrow. I'm going to, cycle 2 hours to work, which might not be feasible, and I'm never going to fly again. I don't think that's the answer. I think the answer is that everyone does 5-10% better, and that together makes a much, much bigger aggregate contribution than just doing these huge sort of like swings towards lifestyle changes.
Thank you. It's so interesting. I think that's really, really helpful and practical as well for people to see. I really love this approach of making the smaller changes. Those in the end are the ones that stick. But I'm interested that you say you don't see a world that's fully vegan. And as you know, I'm passionate about veganism and believe it has so many benefits, not only for the environment, but also for human health and for, longevity of life, quality of life, mindset. So I'm just wondering why that's something that you call out as not being something that you would advocate for, a vegan future.
I think the point to take away from it is not specific to the veganness, is more, I don't believe in revolution. for environmental outcomes. I believe in evolution. And I believe that changing at the margin is the way in which you will ingratiate yourself and access the wide audience. Now, I do think veganism is great. I actually happen to just love cheese, so I'm very rarely full vegan, but I do regularly, eat no fish or meat for kind of weeks at a time. But I think that the answer towards big mass change is being approachable and hospitable in the direction that you want to go. And of course, if the majority of people want to, end up being vegan, terrific, absolutely. But I'm not going to walk into a room of people that have meat 2 meals a day, 7 times a week, and say, you need to go from this to vegan. I think that's a hard sell. And I think actually you won't. My experience is it will be very difficult to achieve that transition. But if I can start by saying, why don't you eat meat once a week, or so once a day? And then why don't you eat meat once every other day? And then, you're so used to this, you started introducing different cooking methods, appreciations of different foods. Okay, why don't you eat meat once a week? If the outcome is vegan, terrific. But I'm not trying to jump or fast track towards the ultimate goal, which is incredibly more, much more sustainable lifestyle and balance. I think there's a journey that a lot of people need to go on, and there's intermediate steps to get there. And breaking it down into a way which isn't scary for them, is a really, really helpful and more collaborative approach.
Yeah, I completely agree with you. I love this approach of going step by step, taking people on a journey. I mean, everybody has to go on their own journey. Humans generally are terrified of change and very resistant to large changes, and then nothing happens at all. I mean, my own, for example, this isn't all about veganism at all, but for example, for me, going vegan was a journey of 10 years from when I first stopped eating meat to when I became fully vegan. And that was my personal journey as I learned and understood the benefits. And I think that's really important in any of these lifestyle changes for people. So I'm sure that your approach is something that people can really actually get on board with and start making those changes. And like you say, it's the sum of all of our efforts together that really make the big difference.
Yeah, look, just to respond to that, I think that's totally right. I think you don't just wake up one day and go, I'm going to flick a switch. I'll give you a great example. A lot of the best Premier League footballers become vegan in their 30s. Ryan Giggs or Jermaine Defoe and various other people. And they've said that the combination of going vegan and becoming much more yoga-based in their exercises or anaerobic exercises and just core fitness has really, really prolonged their careers. Well, in the case of these two have retired, but prolonged their careers and allowed them to be much fitter men in their 30s than they were in their 20s. I think that all speaks to this idea that it's around education, it's around understanding what the benefits are of these activities. And it's about creating narratives and products and tools and services that just don't frighten people. That allow people to say, yeah, well, I'm going to dip my toe in this. And then, I've dipped my toe. Okay, well, maybe I'm going to put my whole body in for a little go. And, I think people like that ability to interact with things in a slightly more sotto voce way. And this is what I was sort of talking to you about, this transition from climate awareness to climate action. For me, the really big trend of the next 20, 30 years is just tweaking the services and the products and the system that we live in, where every activity just includes environmental outcomes in how it's being built, so that you're not being force-fed this diet of, I am an eco-warrior. From the towels that you use in your shower, to the washing machine that you wash them in, to the food that you have on your table, to the way in which you get to work. Each one of these little actions just needs to be tweaked, 2 to 5%. And the aggregate outcome is incredibly powerful. And I think that's sort of what I would say in sort of bringing it all together. Revolution is a scary word, and the era of climate action is about everyone and every facet of the economy and every facet of society taking this stuff on board and thinking, how do I do this a little bit better? And then how do I do it a little bit better even more? That's what I would say.
So what's the future? What's your vision for where you'd like Carbon to take things?
For BeZero and for the economy, I think, as I said, I think I was having a conversation with someone, and he was saying, you reconciling yourself with capitalism? What are you going on? What's going on with you in terms of sort of philosophically? And a phrase that I stumbled across, but I do think is helpful for this, is we spent a lot of time trying to bring capitalism to the environment. And I think actually the future is that we bring the environment to capitalism. And that's not defeatist, and that's not to say that, capitalism is perfect or anything like that. I just think that it's very hard to fight the system at a sort of total meta level. But the environment is actually a service. The environment is a service. It provides us with health, with clean oxygen. It provides us with places to go, animals, all the things that the ecosystem provides us, you could argue, is a huge service. And understanding that service in the terms that we value work and labor and Mars bars and tractors and houses and all other things that we see as being sort of services and products, that is how I see the future emerging. And I think that's the big trend that's going on in financial markets and increasingly in sort of on the high street, is shifting the environment from being this virtuous other thing to being just something that we consider as being part of our entire system. And to take a step back, one thing I love is this idea is this concept of ecological economics, and that the economy operates within the ecology of the world because they all interact. But traditionally, in the past 200 years, we've basically seen ecology or the environment as existing within the economy. And so I think the big transition philosophically is this idea that we exist within the planetary boundaries, not that we can just completely command and control the planetary boundaries. And the environment is just something that is a bit of a pain that we have to deal with as we grow and prosper and, raise living standards and, alleviate poverty. They're a thing that has to coexist, but actually human activity exists within the broader ecosystem. And that's the right way to think about it.
It's a very thought-provoking perspective and really well shared. I'm just wondering, isn't it dangerous to see the environment as a service? Because to me, that implies it's something which is external to us, which is perhaps not deeply connected to us and something for us to use, rather than something which is in the end part of us. We are the environment is us. And I believe that when we start to shift our mindset to seeing that we are nature and we are all the same, and that when we look after nature, we look after ourselves, that we can see some huge changes. And this seems like maybe a place in the middle.
I don't disagree with you at all, what you're just saying. I mean, I would flip it on its head and say, I think that's the same thing. That, look, the history of modern society has been a fight between the people that operate within an economy and the money that governs that economy, labor and capital. And traditionally, land has been the one that people forget. There's three factors of production. There's land, there's labor and capital. And most of our system has been this argument, look at the American elections right now, between who governs society and how do we value that. Now, labor is a service. No one's suggesting that you don't value people if you value that service. They're saying that's exactly how you do value those people, ideas of utility, etc. So I think the argument has been that land is this separate thing. All I'm trying to say is I think the big trend, it will be that people see the environment as being part of ourselves. As you said, we are nature and nature is us. And, to go to sort of a geography idea, there's this traditional binary or dichotomy called culture-nature binary. And I think culture and nature are the same thing. And I think the way in which that translates is that people start seeing the environmental outcomes as being one of the many outcomes from our actions, or indeed they see our interactions with the environment as one of the many ways in which the environment exists. And the otherness of culture, human activity, and nature as being this sort of separate thing, that is what I think is decomposing and they're sort of ending. And so actually, I think they're part of the same thing. My hypothesis is that that's going to take place by people trying to explain the environment in a way that the system already understands, because it's very, very difficult. I don't know why necessarily for everyone, but it's difficult for people to understand the environment as just being this other great big thing. I think there needs to be ways, and this is my hypothesis of climate action, where people kind of bring what human wants, the psychology and of the Anthropocene, if you want to use a sort of ecological word, of the human-based ecosystem, and they bring that together with the narrative of the environment in a way which aligns the two, as you say. All I'm suggesting is that the creation of this sort of service, this service, I don't mean service like, a person giving you coffee at Pret. I mean service in the sense that we exist off the fruits of nature, whether that's fossil fuels, which are a naturally occurring thing, or it's apples from the orchard, or wind from geographic change. They're all services, and our ability to harness them, you could call them, they're all products, or, services doesn't have to be the right word. Our ability to harness them is basically how we govern society. We drill things up, we plant things, you've surely read Sapiens. And in many ways, you could say that we are governed by the plants and the crops and the animals that have made themselves accommodating to the things that we want. I love this idea that sheep govern humans. We don't govern sheep. Sheep have told us that, look, you're great. You'll use our wool. You use our meat. So there's 50 million or whatever there are, 50 billion sheep in the world. I love this idea that sheep have forced us to use them. So that interaction with service isn't a dirty word. It's just about saying, pollination. Bees provide a service. They pollinate plants, and those plants provide us with biodiversity benefits, and those biodiversity benefits go into the nutrition cycles, and they're things that other people eat, and we eat them. It's part of this this cycle. And I think a service is not a bad word. I think service is a fine word to use. It's not creating a sort of capitalist alternative. It's more just saying we benefit from this thing that's naturally occurring. How do we value that thing and make sure that we build that into our future sort of system?
Got it. Yeah. It's the same thing, but just speaking the language of the people who are ultimately in the positions to make decisions and make changes at this time.
Yeah, I think that's a really, really good way of saying it. My argument would be, how do I convince 50 boardrooms with 50 different priorities, or 50 households, or 50 communities from different cultures, from different backgrounds, in a language which they can all understand, in a way in which doesn't terrify them, but in a way where they can all, do it for their own reasons. I don't mind if you want to engage with environmental action because you want to be more profitable, or you want to save the planet, or you want to make sure that your employees value their work experience, or whatever it might be. The key thing is that you're doing it, and that's where I'm agnostic. I want people to be doing this, and if I can talk a language which encourages them to do it, I'm happy to talk that language.
Tommy, I could talk to you about this all day, but I'm really aware of time, so I'm going to bring our conversation to a close. I've just got a couple of quick questions to ask you.
Sure.
And the first one is, what does personal success look like to you now, and how has this changed from your days at Merrill Lynch in New York?
I think personal success, in a very selfish way, would be, having the ability to live a life and support my family and support my loved ones at a very sort of material level. And more broadly, getting up every day and thinking, look, what I'm doing is using the skills that I've acquired and all of the benefits and incredible privileges of living and growing up in central London for something that wants to help in a small way transition us towards a world that I think is a slightly more, or is a much more interesting place to live, and one that's ultimately going to leave things better than we found them. So my kind of term is this thing called custodianism. So leave things better than we found them. So success is contributing towards leaving things better than we found them. That's what I'd say.
That's beautiful. And is there a book that you've read recently and loved that you can share with us?
Yeah, so I'm going to slightly talk my book here, and you know him very well, but our dear friend, a guy called Merlin Sheldrake, is a wonderful biologist and mycologist, I believe, has released a book which is, I think, one of BBC's books of the month, called Entangled Life: How Fungi Make Our Worlds, Change Our Minds, and Shape Our Futures. And Merlin is a dear friend of mine from school, and prize-winning scientist at Cambridge, and he's sort of gone out and spent 2 years on this incredible journey, although really 33 years, but 2 years on this journey, writing this absolute sort of homage to fungi, and why this kingdom, which is not plant or animal, is just so integral to our lives, and it is one of the sort of main science books of the moment. But what it really does a terrific job of is just bringing this other world of mushrooms and of fungal networks, to a place where you as a normal person could understand them. The birth of fossil fuels comes from the lack of a particular fungus. Our ability to create medicines come from various different types of properties. Just, it's a terrific and incredibly well written explanation of this kingdom, the fungi, but also of human interaction with them, and all the little things at the margin which we don't really see, but actually the way in which we have been shaped by fungi. I think so. It's a terrific book and a terrific read.
Amazing. My sister actually bought me this book already without knowing that I know Merlin. So I'm really, really excited to read it. It's next on my reading list, so we can share notes next week, maybe.
Yeah, no, 100%. And I would encourage everyone to read it. It's an amazing read, and he does a great job of trying to bring a incredibly difficult subject to the sort of the everyday parlance.
Wonderful. So thank you, Tommy, so much for joining us. And lastly, where's the best place for listeners to find you and your work online?
Well, as with any new company, we're still sort of fleshing everything out, but BeZero.co, BeZero Carbon.co, that's our website. And hopefully in the next sort of 6 months, we'll have a much more fleshed out sort of PR proposition. But by all means, anyone's welcome to email me, Tommy at BeZero.co, and I'm always happy to talk and help anyone who's interested in this sort of agenda.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for your time, Tommy.
Thank you so much, Nikki.
I love how Tommy describes the feeling of being hit by a train when he discovered his true purpose, a clear calling to his mission, which sounds incredibly powerful and energetic. Tommy mentions the book Sapiens by Yuval Noah Harari, which I absolutely loved and recommend if you haven't read it yet. The point Tommy raises is one that stuck in my mind too, how when we stopped relying on hunting and gathering and started cultivating crops and domestic animals, these crops and animals became the most plentiful in the world. So did they win over us? From a numbers perspective, perhaps yes, as we brought them all over the world and worked hard to multiply them, but not from a freedom perspective when you look at their quality of life, for the animals at least. Humans have left their freedom too, from nomads living in abundance to working the fields and depending on what we produce. It's a really thought-provoking idea because it calls into question what is the cost of what we see as social development. I think that Tommy's solution to bring the environment to capitalism is very progressive and exciting. His approach of decarbonisation is a big step in the right direction, and I can see the benefits of speaking the language of the capitalist system we are part of to get them to make changes that absolutely have to be made. However, I do still feel that the ultimate goal needs to be to open people up to their own nature, to understand their connection and their oneness with nature and each other, so they can truly evolve how they impact this world for the better. As Tommy says, for his own mission, so everybody can leave the world a better place than they found it. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe now. And if you're on Apple Podcasts, please leave a 5-star rating and short review. If you think people you know might benefit from listening to Going Conscious, please share it with them. I know I get much of my inspiration from podcasts which are shared with me. For all episodes, our library and more, visit goingconscious.com. Your support to spread this positive message of fulfillment and freedom means so much. As well as hosting Going Conscious, I help conscious entrepreneurs to transition and unleash their power and purpose with my transformation coaching and conscious brand consulting work. Discover more on Instagram at Nikki Trott or on my website, nikkitrott.com. I'd love to hear from you and to talk about your goals, questions, or how we can work together. And if I don't hear from you before then, see you next Wednesday on the next episode of Going Conscious. As always, live your freedom.